Today we're reading chapter 7 of Soldier's Heart, and it is entitled Town Life. They went into camp again, and this time they sat for 3 months. They were there so long they thought of the camp as a town. They began to give the paths between the tents street names based on old Minnesota towns. Soon signs were stuck on poles: Winona Avenue, Taylor Falls Street, St. Paul Road. It went from summer into fall. They cut down trees and made log shanties. They drilled in the rain and then in the snow, but spent most of their time in the log huts, plugging leaks, keeping out the cold wind, and trying to get their clothes dry. They were rarely successful. Disease spread through the camp like fire as the weather worsened, and with the disease came rumors. It was said that General McClellan was afraid to fight. Almost all the men, including Charlie, loved their new commander and felt that he was only trying to be easy on the men by avoiding a winter campaign. But the rumors said that Lincoln. Most of the men also loved the president. They called him old rail splitters. But he was dissatisfied with McClellan's lack of bite and wanted some attack made on the rebels somewhere, sometime soon. This did not translate into any action, and the men sat around for another month, getting sicker and sicker, both physically and in their spirits. Rumors said that a whole regiment from New York had deserted and gone home. Turned out it wasn't true. 4 men had deserted from a New York regiment, had been caught and tried and shot by a firing squad for leaving, but it still showed the lack of morale. Another rumor said that a young general named Grant was out west in Tennessee. He'd fetched the rebels such a hit that he'd whipped their Western army, and that Grant was a drunk, and that Lincoln had said, "Find out what kind of whiskey he's drinking, and send that case to all my generals." This proved to be the truth, but none of it really mattered to Charlie. Like most of the men, he worked at taking care of himself. Kept him busy. Kept his mind busy. The camp was worse than a pigsty. Men from the country, most of the Minnesota volunteers, knew about country living. They dug holes for latrines, kept their areas cleaner than others, and worked at getting good shelter. Men from the cities, New Yorkers were the worst, had little concept of living on the land and had no idea how to take care of themselves. They left their raw sewage in the open, didn't drain the sop from their shelters, and constantly were virtually destroyed by diseases. Some New York companies lost more than half their men to dysentery, typhus, measles, diarrhea, which soon began to spread to other units. It seemed somebody was always either getting sick, was sick, or was getting over being sick. Charlie and the rest were kept moving, just working on repairing the shelters, keeping things clean, and cooking. The food was simple, and for the most part, pretty bad. Beans, always beans, salt, pork, and coffee. Soon a bakery with wood-fired ovens was going, and bread was doled out to the men. The plan was to give each man a pound of bread a day, but it rarely worked out that well. The sutlers kept plying their trade and brought cakes and pies and cookies to the men, but their prices kept going up. 50 cents for a cake that tasted as if it was made out of wood. Most of the men only bought from the sutlers in dire emergencies. Charlie once relented and bought an apple pie, but when he sat down to eat it, there were only 3 small slices of apple in it, and nearly no sugar. If they had the ingredients, housewives on nearby farms cooked and sold meals to the men. But getting food this way was chancy, to say the least. There were over 90,000 men in the camp, and perhaps 20 farms where food might be available. To feed all of those men 3 meals a day, the farm wives would have had to make 13 to 15,000 meals a day. Besides, those officers seemed to get most of the good food. Officers were initially the only ones allowed whiskey as well. Charlie didn't drink, but like everybody else, they thought it was unfair in the extreme that only officers were considered able to handle it. There was a small mutiny among some of the units, and soon whiskey was made available to all the troops. Although the enlisted men were to be issued it by the sutlers, 1 shot a day to ward off the ague, chill, and fever of winter, they were supposed to drink it right where they were given it. So the idea, of course, is to make sure that the general soldiers aren't getting drunk. So they were given that shot of whiskey by the doctor to kind of keep the fever and the chill, and it's a warm, makes them feel warm. but they had to do it right there in front of the doctor. This wasn't like you were going to leave and mess around. There was very little that was fair about the entire situation, at least from Charlie's viewpoint, and it quickly became obvious to him that it was every man for himself in the camp. He became an adept at camp survival. He pulled his own weight, took his turn gathering food and wood, cleaning, cooking, but he made a private world for himself. He kept to his own thoughts and his own knowledge. He worked constantly on his equipment, shining the leather, changing his cartridges if they became damp or seemed even a little bit moist, and most of all, tending to his feet and to his rifle. When they talk about tending to his feet, remember this is going to be a really muddy area, and one of the things they had to really be careful of is what's called, in World War I, they'll call it trench foot, but it's the same idea that muddy areas start seeping into your socks and your shoes, especially if they're made out of leather and cotton like they were, and they end up basically rotting your skin away on your foot. It kind of rots your skin away, and you end up with, then you can get gangrene, and then you could lose your leg. I mean, it's actually a really, really bad thing to get, all just from being in mud. So they had to constantly keep their feet clean with clean socks on and clean shoes so that they didn't get that. Charlie, you're going to wear that rifle right out, a man named Campbell told him one night while they were out by the trench stove. They'd learned how to dig a trench a foot wide and a foot deep along the floor of their shelter, then out under a wall and into the open. The trench was covered with flat rocks, and a barrel was placed over the opening outside to make a passable chimney. When the men built a fire in the trench inside the log hut, the rocks would become hot and heat up the whole shelter. So they've got this log house, and then they've built a trench in the log house going outside. So like it's going to go, the smoke's going to go out, but all the rocks in the bottom of it are going to heat up. Like the coals are basically, you're basically heating up the upper part of that log house. And remember, heat rises, so it kind of keeps that log cabin all toasty and warm. It's quite genius, actually. Pathfinders, take notes next time you do a winter camp out. Charlie looked up at Campbell, then back at his rifle. He'd forgotten none of what had happened. He knew it would come again. It had to come again, because they were still here. He did not have an army without a battle. It was what the generals wanted and what they needed, a battle to use their armies. On both sides, it was all up to the generals, up to the officers. It was left up to the men who did the killing and the dying. There would be no war. I read that wrong. I'm going to reread that. It was what the generals wanted, what they needed, a battle to use their armies. On both sides, it was always up to the generals, the officers. If it had been left up to the men who did the killing and the dying, there never would be a war. It makes more sense. Death would come. I'll be needing this rifle. He spoke down as if talking to the weapon. He did not like to look at people as much as he once did. He did not like to learn about them. It was better if he didn't know them, didn't become too friendly with them. They died too fast. Psh, we'll be in this camp all winter. There ain't going to be a fight when it's cold. Charlie said nothing, but he remembered a night on guard duty. Down along the river, he was put on picket duty, making sure there'd be warning if the Rebs on the other side of the river decided to attack them. That night, he was hunkered down behind an old oak tree to get out of the wind. It was so cold, he was reminded of Minnesota. And then he heard a voice come down from the river, low in a soft southern drawl. "Hey, Union, can you hear me?" Charlie didn't answer. "Hey, Blue Belly, are you deaf?" Oh, well, Charlie thought, why not talk to him? "What do you want?" "Just to talk. Maybe do a little trading." "Trade bullets," Charlie said. "That's all you want?" "Nah, it's too cold to fight. Got me some good cut tobacco over here. Got any coffee? We're down to burned oats for coffee in the morning." As it happened, Charlie had a little extra half-pound of coffee beans that he'd been issued just that afternoon. 4 months they hadn't had coffee at all, and he'd been using burned oats themselves for hot morning drinks. But when ration came, as usual, the army would get it wrong and issue triple the rations. Now there was tons of coffee. Charlie didn't use tobacco, but he knew men who did, and Southern tobacco was much better than that foreign tobacco unavailable to the Union Army now that the South had seceded. He could trade the tobacco that he got for bread, pies, and maybe even some leather to fix a shoe. How are we going to trade? Charlie called back. Well, I got me a plank, and I'll throw a line over to your side on the rock, and you pull the plank across with the tobacco, and I'll pull it back with the coffee. Just don't shoot me when I stand up. All right, I won't. There was a half moon, and Charlie peeked around the oak and watched as the slight figure stood up on the other side of the river. He was dressed poorly. His feet were wrapped in what looked like sacks, and his coat was tattered and worn. Even in the moonlight, he could see that the boy's face was dirty. He thought, I probably looked the same, but the Reb looked even younger than Charlie. Mind the stone, the boy called, and threw a rock with a string tied to it. The river was 40 feet wide, and the string snarled on the first toss, and he had to retrieve it and toss it twice more before the rock made it across the river. Charlie moved from behind the oak and picked up the string. He kept low. Couldn't help it. But in a few minutes, he'd pulled the board across the river, and he found the tobacco wrapped in a cloth. He wrapped up his coffee beans, put the package back on the plank. All right, pull it back, he yelled, and the piece of wood quietly made its way back across the water. Charlie watched it until it reached the other bank, and then he moved behind the oak, squatted down at the sight, and tucked the tobacco inside his coat. Hey, Bluebelly, you still there? Yeah, I'm here. This coffee looks good. Can you get more? Some. Hey, let's trade again tomorrow night. I can get all the tobacco you need. All right. There was another silence, and then, where are you from, Union? Minnesota. Where's that? How could he not know where Minnesota was? Up north. North of Iowa. Oh, from Alabama. You a farmer? I've worked on farms. Me too. What do you guys grow? Potatoes, corn, squash, wheat, oats, barley. Same as us, except we have greens and baccy and some rice on the bottoms. This right ain't stupid, isn't it? What? This is right stupid, ain't it? Here we be, both farmers, talking and trading goods. Tomorrow, the next day, we got to shoot at each other. I hope, Charlie thought, you don't hit me. Ain't it stupid? The boy asked again. Yeah. I got to go now. My trick's near up. I'll yell for you tomorrow night. And that was it. There was no further talk, no further trading, because an officer had heard Charlie and jumped him, yelled at him about speaking to the enemy. And the same must have happened to the Reb, because the next night, Charlie leaned against the oak, and somebody shot at him from the other side of the river and drew splinters off the tree 4 feet above his head. The truce and the trading, well, it was over.